An internet-facing web server sits in the DMZ of an organization that has done everything right. They tuned detections to recent China link clusters, they tracked the published techniques, they built the indicator sets. However, a brand new campaign has been engineered to evade those exact defenses, so the attacker slips quietly past. Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Alexandra Moore, Threat Intelligence Manager.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today I have a question for our listeners. So what if the defenses that are built specifically for nation-state threat actors still leave unexpected coverage gaps?
Yes, that's what we're getting into today. And it's not just a hypothetical exercise here. It's a real campaign against IIS servers, one that we uncovered in our most recent report against threat cluster OP-512.
Exactly. And our report really discusses how a China-linked threat actor likely engineered their activity to evade defenses from known similar campaigns. And it's really another example of a recurring pain point for defenders here. When your detection rules are built around known indicators for prior clusters, things like file hashes and DNS patterns, what happens when the attackers adapt to those known defenses?
Yeah, exactly, John. And while we can never really know what threat actors are thinking or what their true intentions are, I think it's a good bet that the smartest and most sophisticated among them are trying to ensure that their behavior isn't being caught by existing defenses. I mean, we've even seen discussions on cybercriminal forums that show adversaries are reading the same threat reports as we do.
Certainly. So let's dive into it with a bit of context here, because really it's not just this single cluster that's been targeting IIS servers, but rather four in total. We've seen four China link clusters, specifically CLCTA 0048, Ghost Redirector, Dragon Rank, and the latest OP-512. They were all documented targeting legacy IIS servers in the same 12-month window.
Yeah, a lot of names and numbers and letters there, but we'll go through all of them in due course. Thanks, John. So first things first, just to explain for those listeners who aren't familiar, IIS stands for Internet Information Services. So this is Microsoft's web server. So basically the middleman that sits between the internet and your applications. So if someone makes a request, IIS passes it to your app and then sends the response back out. And in the attack that we're going to discuss throughout this episode, a suspected China-linked attacker broke into a legacy IIS web server that was running an unsupported version of .NET. Then they dropped a custom web shell that was uniquely encrypted per deployment and time-stamped to be able to slip past signature-based detection. From there, they were able to set up multiple command channels, escalate privileges with publicly available exploit tools, and quietly establish persistence, likely to conduct espionage. And I think what's really cool about this, and just want to mention it right at the start of the episode, is that this chain of events was stitched together because our agentic AI system essentially correlated what otherwise looked like unrelated low priority events. And then when our threat research team started to look into this further, we concluded that the actor that was likely responsible here was probably a new cluster, which we've dubbed OP-512. So what I want to talk about first, John, is what makes IIS the focal point of our story here, because I think our audience might be wondering whether this is just a China threat actor campaign that happens to involve IIS or whether IIS itself is the story.
Yeah, so to be very clear, IIS really is the story here. And specifically, it's the legacy IIS servers that are sitting in a DMZ, and they're being targeted for a few reasons. One, they sit at that perimeter, externally accessible by design to serve those web requests. Two, the .NET framework stack that's running on a lot of them is old enough to have a well-documented attack surface. And generally, monitoring coverage in that DMZ is lighter than what you'd expect in core internal systems. So kind of taking it back, we've had four named and documented clusters that are doing the same espionage targeting on a specific technology in under 12 months. And it really shows that this is becoming a preferred target.
And John, I think we're assessing that these types of attacks on IIS infrastructure are likely going to continue throughout 2026 and 2027.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We anticipate that the trajectory of these style of attacks, it's not going to slow down. More attacks are coming. But there's also a specific reason that OP-512 in and of itself belongs in a separate category from the other three clusters we've seen attacking these IIS servers. And that is every deployment that they have generates a cryptographically unique installation. It includes different RSA keys, randomized variable names, and randomized method names. Essentially, two instances of the same framework don't look alike, and they produce completely different file hashes. OP-512 also uses a DNS technique that uses hexadecimal characters in the subdomain to encode information. And in fact, two clusters that we've seen, the most recent OP-512 and a previous one, CLSTA0048, both use this tactic, but deployed it in different use cases. CLSTA0048 used it to exfiltrate data, whereas most recently OP-512 used that same method to self-report its own deployment location back to its C2 or command and control infrastructure. Another important element of this report and this attack is that the server that got compromised was running a .NET stack that had been out of support since 2016, which really means a decade without patches and security updates, making it an easy target for attackers.
Thanks for the explanation there. There's certainly a lot to pull apart and a lot to explore there. So now that we've given a brief explanation of what actually happened in this incident, let's start pulling out some of the learnings that we can discuss here. The first real takeaway for defenders here is that because of the novel techniques that OP-512 was using, the defenses and detection rules that have been tuned to those three prior named clusters, I'm not going to say the names because there's lots of numbers there, are likely not designed to catch OP-512. Because they've been around for a while at this point, those first three clusters have got identifiable tooling. You could build detection around their known fingerprints. So things like file hashes and behavioral patterns and known infrastructure. OP-512's framework seems to have been designed to sort of operate outside of those known patterns.
Yeah, and really just to put a specific example of that, because I think we have a great one from the report, was really back to those changes across campaigns we mentioned earlier in the different uses of the hex subdomains. So, for example, a detection rule that was built around CLSTA004's exfiltration pattern would not fire on OP-512's command and control reporting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example to bring in there. Thanks, John. And the second takeaway that I want to discuss is what happens after that behavioral alert fires. Because in this case, killing the process wasn't the same as containing and remediating. And this is something we actually do see crop up quite regularly. So I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about it now. Essentially, one of the few detections in this incident that did fire was an EDR alert at the privilege escalation stage. And this wasn't signature based, it was actually behavioral. The .NET code loaded straight into memory at runtime without ever touching the disk. The endpoint protection then killed the process. But the real sort of kicker here, I guess, is that IIS just restarted the web work process or W3 WP exe when that happens.
Yeah, and really just to layer in on that, that's the default behavior. It's what it's designed to do. It needs to keep that web application available.
Yeah, absolutely. This is everything behaving exactly as it should here. But the problem is, of course, that the attacker's tooling is also reloading right alongside it. So their access is staying intact. And what you end up with here is this loop. You have prevention fire, process dies, IIS spins it back up, and then the attacker's still there. So as you said, the prevention kept doing its job, but the activity just kept going.
Yeah, and really that loop that you just mentioned in this report, it allowed the threat actors to maintain access for over 75 days.
Mm.
The timeline shows web shell activity on that same host 75 days before the primary events. And when they returned, that is when the threat actors returned, they used different command and control infrastructure, including domains, on that second visit. really making things more challenging for the defenders yet again.
Yeah, familiar story there. And there's also the persistence layer to think about here. So OP-512's web shells compile down into DLL files that end up sitting in temporary directories. And those DLLs stick around even after the web shell source files get deleted. So that means that if an incident responder comes in, clears out all the visible web shell artifacts, and then closes the ticket, but doesn't go and clean up all those temp compilation directories, they're essentially left functional persistence behind, and that means that the attacker still has a way back in. So to put it simply, I suppose, if you're killing the process but not isolating the host, you're not really breaking that cycle. The loop is still going to be there, and the attacker can still come back on the next restart. And in this case, that's exactly what we saw. The attacker came back to the same host months later, as you mentioned, but just using totally different infrastructure.
Yeah, all right. So we've laid out the threat, but after the break, we're going to cover 3 specific things that your team can configure or ask before the next cluster lands.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Welcome back. We left off talking about how even mature defenses have coverage gaps when threat actors are innovating. So let's work through what you can actually do about it. First, we want to highlight the infrastructure exposure itself, because I think 4 clusters that are all converging on the same stack is like a targeting signal that defenders should really be taking note of and planning for.
Yeah, it exactly is. And just to restate quickly that we had those 4 named China Link clusters in 12 months converging on internet facing IIS servers, and especially those servers that were running end of life .NET frameworks. So really, if you're running this in your organization, then you're making yourself a prime target. And also, as mentioned, we expect this targeting to grow into the second half of 2026. Really, the takeaway here is that if your migration for this legacy IIS and .NET server is sitting in a maintenance backlog somewhere, then you're just buying time for the threat actors.
Okay, yeah. So really, any plan that's treating this migration with normal or with low urgency is really misscoped. It has to be prioritized ASAP.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. And there's also a capability on the defender side that can help with this. Really an AI driven attack surface inventory can be used to scan your environment and look for these exposures that an adversary can exploit. The best tools will even prioritize their findings so your team can quickly action what is most likely to be exploited. So the morning action here is pretty straightforward. Tomorrow, ask your team 2 questions. Really, do we have internet facing IIS servers that are running end of life.net? And for any that exist, is there segmentation controls active today? And is migration on the roadmap as soon as possible? So the second piece we want to highlight is going to be what happens after the alert fires, because the record we saw really shows that incomplete remediation, such as only process termination, is not going far enough.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the real gap here was that there was no automated host isolation set up that would trigger when the alert fired. So as we said, what happened is that the process gets killed, IIS restarts it, and the attacker's tooling just reloads right alongside it, and the whole cycle just keeps going again and again. So what containment would do in this instance is actually to buy your defenders the time that they need. Time to go in, time to look at the host properly, time to clear out all of those malicious files and make sure that the attacker is actually gone and not just paused. And like we've talked about in other episodes, you really need some sort of pre-approved automated response workflow in place. You don't want to be thinking about it when these incidents are kicking off. And in this case, we would need something that fires host isolation the moment you see that IIS worker process start to kick out DNS queries to those weird hex segmented subdomains that John mentioned at the start of the episode. That's exactly the behavior that you want to catch, and you want to catch it automatically before someone has to make a judgment call and all the delays that could go alongside doing that manually and having those processes go through multiple different people.
Yeah, certainly. And there's another important piece to layer into that, which is going to be the DLL persistence, right? So the web shell files, they might have been removed, but the directories weren't. And what we saw with OP-512 is that the web shells compile into DLLs in temporary directories. And those DLL files stay there even if the web shell files are deleted themselves. So any response procedures to IIS compromises need an explicit step after the web shell is removed. You need to hunt and clear for the temporary directories as a separate named action. And if that step is not in your run book, it's not going to happen under the time pressure when it's needed.
Just to come in there, John, I think those are really sort of concrete recommendations that people can take away, right? I think those are some really good steps that they can implement into their security programs.
Yeah, definitely. And in this case, it certainly would have helped a complete remediation and prevented the threat actor from regaining access to the host. So the last one we want to highlight is going to be the harder question here. And it's really one that addresses the gap that neither of the first two layers alone can close.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's important to say at this point that named cluster indicator hardening is really valuable. So building and maintaining coverage and defenses against threat actors and threat clusters that we know a lot about. We know their behavior, we know their IOCs. That's a really necessary part of a mature security program. And nothing that we've said in today's conversation is an argument against that. It's more to say that as soon as you've put some of these defenses in place, there's going to be a new threat actor that's coming knocking. It's this constant game of whack-a-mole. So it's really just to highlight that in this incident that we looked at, the campaign had so many elements that were able to evade detections that were specifically built around those previous clusters. It's just a really good example of this constant whack-a-mole, like I said.
Yeah, and really it's the distinction between, the everyday and the advanced campaigns.
Right.
But something to pull out here for defenders really is that they need cross signal, or I should say cross source signal correlation. And in the OP-512 incident, there were multiple signals across different sources. We had the prior web shell activity that was 75 days before that main intrusion, EDR behavioral alerts during the event, DNS query anomalies for those hex subdomains. In each one of those reviewed in isolation might not cross an alert threshold to be escalated or to take immediate containment action. But assembled together, they describe a full intrusion with a documented return visit, deliberate infrastructure rotation, and persistence through two different survival mechanisms. That picture is only visible when you look across the sources at the same time. And really, a capability that can address this here is going to be specialized AI agents that can work continuously across your detection sources, your EDR telemetry, your DNS, your network logs, those ISS process monitoring, and correlate the signals at machine speed. The cross-source patterns that are revealed from a manual analyst review just in reality assemble too slowly and are unlikely to catch the activity before the detection and containment window closes. The agent does the assembly work across your sources, and then your analysts can review the assembled full picture and make decisions quickly with all the information at hand and the threat contained, so they have the time they need to make those decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I think AI is a real key element of the defense here. It's really something that security programs and defenders can use to their advantage to be able to piece together all those disparate pieces of information that John just mentioned and do that in a timely manner. As we've talked about before, speed is really important in circumstances like this. So let's close this out. We're coming to the end of the episode. What do you actually do with everything that we just walked through? I'm going to start on the leadership side. So I think the thing to take away here is that the argument today is additive, right, rather than reductive. We know that named cluster indicator programs are worth building and maintaining, and hopefully we've emphasized that throughout the episode. That coverage is still really necessary. What OP-512 showcased is how threat actors will be changing constantly to evade known detections and indicators. So the question is whether your security program has a layer that operates on cross-source signals that can piece together the limited information that's left by some of these advanced threat actors to allow you to see the full picture. So tomorrow morning, ask your team, when our detection sources each generate a separate low confidence signal from the same host, is there anything in our current workflow that's correlating those signals automatically? Pair that with the migration question that we've talked about. Do we have internet-facing IIS servers that are running end-of-life.net? And is migration on the roadmap this quarter, this year, anywhere in the future? I think from what we've seen, 4 name clusters in 12 months, that pattern's only going to grow.
Yeah, it certainly is. And really those recommendations would have helped stop this attack in its tracks. To layer on a couple more for the operator side of things, 2 specific configuration checks, both of which are actionable today before you finish your day. First one's going to be open your security management platform and verify that you have automated host isolation active and scoped correctly to alert on that ISS worker process, also known as W3WP.exe, communicating to the hex segmented subdomains. And really, this will ensure that your team has the time to follow up with a full investigation because it contained the threat ahead of time. Second, pull your incident response procedure and ensure that there is a step that covers the IIS temporary directory cleanup. If there isn't one, you need to add it before the next IIS related incident goes into your queue. And the step needs to be explicitly named in your runbook so that an analyst who's trying to go through all the emergency steps at 2 a.m. isn't trying to figure this out on the fly, making it more likely they're going to miss something.
Yes, China-linked espionage against legacy infrastructure is not slowing down. The real question is whether your security program is ready for threat actors that evolve to evade known defenses. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away, so you can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It really will make a huge difference and help us to reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.